Clause 60.1 of the NEC 3 form of contract sets out a definitive list of all the ways in which you can have a compensation event. And there's 19 different headings. Some, in my experience, are used quite frequently, others less so. So which ones, John, do you see happening most often, or ones that are most appropriately used?
The one that is most often used, and I think the NEC users groups from years ago did a survey on this, is the first one, which is changes to the works information. Project manager instructs to change the works information, don't do that, do this instead, whatever it is.
Obviously, I think that's the one compensation, and I agree with, from my experience, that's the one that I see most often, but it's the one that's probably the most easy to eliminate if you've done a lot of the work properly in the design phase and the procurement phase. So it's somewhat surprising, perhaps, Ian, that after 25 years of operation, we're still seeing 60.11 being relied upon quite so heavily as we see it, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it should be reduced in usage by getting the works information right, getting the spec done completely clear at the very start, so the employer knows what they want and can articulate it. But at the same time, construction is not an exact science. Things change. You hit problems on site, employers change their mind, they want things that are different. So very often you are going to get a level of change. So I think you're never going to eliminate it unless you say to the employer, you can't change your mind, you can't change your spec, you can't have anything other than what you immediately ordered at the start. And on a 1 year, 2 year, 3 year construction process, that's unrealistic. So 60, that provision is always going to be required.
Ewan, which other of the headings of compensation event do you see coming up fairly often?
Something that's not done by the date indicated in the programme, or late information type claims. Weather, 1 in 10 year events. Unforeseen, sort of the equivalent of the unforeseen physical conditions. It is really, I think, what we're describing are the normal events that cause delay, disruption, and additional costs, which is change, late information, unforeseen physical conditions, and weather. Those are the sort of the typical ones.
And for quite a few of these compensation event types, we can sort of group them together, they're fairly typical, aren't they, John? I mean, you see repetition from the way the NEC deals with unforeseen physical conditions is replicated in FIDIC and ICE, the same sorts of principles. So have we moved on at all in NEC?
I think we going back to the most common one, I think we have, in terms of the clarity of which it is a compensation, a change to the works information, that is a compensation event. What you have to say is, under the NEC, there's two big questions. One, is it a compensation event, yes or no? And the next one is, what's the quantum of it? And there's a process which links them between. I think the clarity under NEC of whether it's a compensation event under change to the works information is a step forwards. I think, you should have known, or it's implied, etc. Well, it's quite clearly a change to the works information, any instruction which changes it. I think in terms of physical conditions, in theory, when I was doing my PhD, there was someone sitting next to me who was doing a PhD on 5 aspects of risk allocation. And in theory, it's clearer, but in practice, I'm not sure if it is. And the weather is clearer, but you have to actually take the weather on site, the weather measurements on site, for it to operate effectively.
And I always find weather an interesting one, because NEC 3 provides for prospective analysis.
Yes.
How do you prospect the weather?
Yes.
You have to wait for it to exceed that 1 in 10 year threshold. So actually, in weather compensation events, you're looking at a retrospective situation.
Yeah.
I think, looking at the list of compensation as a whole, I think it's actually very good the way the NEC approaches it. I know some clients have looked at the 19 standard compensation events plus the others in the secondary options and option B, etc., and say, well, there's too many reasons why the contractor can claim time or money. I don't like this form of contract. And yet, when you go through that list, I think virtually every one of those items would be a compensation under most other contract forms. They're just better articulated. They're not lost in other provisions. They're not claims for breach of contract because someone didn't fulfill an obligation. So I think it makes it a lot easier and clearer to say it's a compensation event and there's the head, we can put it underneath. Process makes it much more simpler.
And building on that, ICE used to have the headings scattered throughout the contract, different mechanisms, different criteria for assessing them. Whereas NEC, they're there in one place. There's the same process for notifying them, submitting them, assessing them, and so on. So once they've entered that funnel,
It's consistent.
it's consistent, and you can have one process for doing it.
Summarising all of that, then I think we would all say that we see 60.11 changes to the works information most often. The list itself of all 19 is quite helpful in firstly breaking the number of events down into bite-sized chunks that you can readily identify, but also at the same time as breaking down, drawing them all together into one place under one process so that it's much more easily definable and manageable at sort of real-time pace on site. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.